In the summer of 2022, under the scorching heat of the small seaside town, everything seemed peaceful. Perched on a hilltop, the house of Michael, a successful businessman, always exuded tranquility. From the house, one could see the vast, shimmering blue ocean, where the town barely bore any trace of crime. The residents lived simple lives, neighbors had known each other for years, and hardly anything ever went wrong. That's why when the police received a call from George, Michael's close friend, reporting a murder, the entire community was shaken. When Detective Jane Harper arrived at the scene, a stifling atmosphere enveloped the large house. George, with a look of shock, stood on the porch, his voice trembling as he recounted discovering Michael's body. I came into the house when I heard a strange noise, but when I got there, he was already lying there. George shook his head, his face unable to hide the astonishment. Jane stepped inside, the faint light from the window not enough to dispel the cold and gloomy feeling of the spacious living room. Michael lay on the sofa, his body motionless, his eyes closed. The forensics team had arrived, and Jane quickly noticed suspicious details. There were no obvious injuries on the body, but that didn't mean the death was natural. A glass of red wine lay tipped over beside the sofa leg, dark red stains soaking into the carpet. Nearby, a bottle of sleeping pills was overturned, the cap still open, as if someone had hurriedly used it before leaving. Jane bent down to inspect, her eyes scrutinizing every detail. The signs on Michael's body suggested he might have been pressed, but there were no fingerprints on the pill bottle or wine glass. The house looked tidy, but something was off. A few cups were slightly out of place on the kitchen shelf, as if someone had hastily left. Jane straightened up, glancing around. Everything seemed too perfect, too ordinary, as if it had been deliberately arranged. George stepped into the room, his eyes still filled with confusion. I can't believe this. Michael was my best friend. How could this have happened? George said, his voice choked with emotion. Jane said nothing, only nodding slightly and taking note of the necessary details. Deep down, she knew this wasn't just a natural death. Something was very wrong, and George, despite his outward shock, might not be as simple as he appeared. Jane looked around once more. The sense of mystery and gloom hanging over the house wouldn't let her shake the suspicion in her mind. The small, mismatched details didn't add up. And this was just the beginning of a more complex case than the peaceful town had ever witnessed. Michael Lavelle was a man known by everyone in town. As the head of the largest construction company in the area, he wasn't just recognized for his wealth, but also for his decisiveness and determination in every business decision. The towering buildings that rose under Michael's hand were proof of his ambition and success. But behind the facade of a prosperous businessman, Michael's family life was crumbling. His marriage to Anna, a gentle and devoted woman to their family, had become increasingly strained. The late nights Michael spent away from home, the endless meetings, and the cold distance between the couple slowly created a gap that became impossible to bridge. Anna, with her fragile appearance, couldn't face the feeling of being abandoned. Although she loved her children, the loneliness and pressure from her failing marriage made her vulnerable to the trap of another relationship. George, Michael's close friend and neighbor, gradually became her emotional crutch. With his warm demeanor and timely presence, George initially seemed like a trustworthy friend to both. He frequently came to help the family, from small tasks to more difficult situations. But behind that friendly facade, George was quietly making his way closer to Anna. No one in town could have suspected that this seemingly kind man was slowly taking advantage of her vulnerability to satisfy his own personal agenda. The relationship between Michael and George had once been deeply connected. Not just in terms of friendship, but also in large business deals. However, over time, the two grew apart, especially after disagreements in a major project. Michael, being ambitious, had pushed George out of the deal, causing their relationship to lose the strength it once had. Even so, they maintained the appearance of friendship in front of everyone. As for Anna, she didn't realize she had been swept into the vortex of deception. She gradually became more comfortable with George's presence, a man who always knew how to listen and console her. Their secret affair deepened, but it remained discreet, never discovered. Anna had no idea that she had become a pawn in George's intricate plan, and each wrong decision only brought her closer to tragedy. George, despite showing concern and grief over discovering Michael's death, couldn't hide certain suspicious signs. To outsiders, he appeared as the model neighbor, a close friend of the Lavelle family. But to those with a keen eye, like Detective Jane Harper, George had more to hide than the facade he deliberately displayed. The relationships between the three main characters gradually revealed a complex web, where love, betrayal, and personal schemes intertwined. Beneath the surface of the town's tranquility, behind the glossy veneer of a successful life, this story would quickly become entangled and tragic. The forensic team swiftly got to work after determining that Michael had died on the sofa in the living room. The forensic doctor carefully examined the external signs and soon concluded that the victim may have been poisoned. However, the specific toxin had yet to be identified. Michael's body bore no signs of violence or foreign objects, but an eerie feeling still hung over the scene. His death was too quiet, too clean, making Detective Jane Harper unable to shake the sense that everything had been staged. Jane looked around the room, where Michael's personal belongings were still neatly arranged. Except for a single overturned wine glass, the wine staining the carpet beneath the sofa. Nearby, an open bottle of sleeping pills lay on a small table beside the sofa. No clear fingerprints were found on either item, a strange and suspicious detail. "This isn't just a case of poisoning," Jane murmured, as various theories began forming in her mind. Jane stepped out onto the porch, where Anna and George stood with a few local police officers. Both of them displayed different emotions. Anna appeared confused and tense, while George remained calm, though a flicker of unease passed through his eyes. Jane decided to take their statements right at the scene to capture their most natural reactions. Anna, her voice filled with worry, claimed she wasn't home at the time of Michael's death. "I was out running a few errands," she said, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "We had been having some disagreements lately. I never thought he would die like this." Jane listened intently, analyzing the truth hidden behind Anna's flustered emotions. In contrast, George's account seemed firmer. "I heard a strange noise from Michael's house while I was next door at mine," he recounted. "I didn't think much of it, just went over to check and found Michael lying there, unresponsive. I didn't know what to do except call the police right away." Both of their stories made sense, but something didn't entirely add up. Jane continued probing, and gradually, more information began surfacing in her mind. The relationship between Anna and Michael hadn't been good for some time, particularly after arguments related to Michael spending too much time on work and neglecting the family. Disputes over time and family responsibilities seemed to be just the tip of a larger problem. As Anna's odd behavior, since Michael's death made Jane increasingly suspicious. Furthermore, as Jane listened to George's statement, she recalled details from past business dealings between Michael and George. They had once collaborated on numerous construction projects, but disputes over financial benefits had arisen. Michael had even threatened to expose George in a major financial fraud case they were both involved in. This raised another possibility. Could George have had a motive to seek revenge on Michael? Based on what was known, both Anna and George had motives, and both appeared suspicious. Jane knew she still had a lot of work to do. The ambiguous signs, along with the condition of the crime scene, forced her to continue the investigation more deeply, but at this point, everything was just beginning. Detective Jane Harper returned to the police station with suspicions about the relationship between Anna and George. From the initial signs of the scene and their inconsistent statements, she knew she needed to dig deeper into their past. Jane requested a review of Anna's phone and computer, and after just a few hours of data analysis, a series of messages between Anna and George surfaced. The content of the conversations revealed an unusual closeness between the two romantic messages. Secret dates, and even plans to meet when Michael wasn't home. At first, Anna denied everything. "I don't have any relationship with George, beyond friendship," she insisted, her voice trembling. However, Jane was not easily convinced. The evidence began piling up, and when Jane confronted her about the recent secret meetings, Anna had no choice but to admit that she and George had been having an affair for several months. Even so, Anna firmly denied being involved in Michael's death. "I may have made mistakes, but I never wanted Michael to die," she said through tears. Meanwhile, results from the forensic lab became clearer. The poison found in Michael's body was a rare substance, only accessible from specialized suppliers. Forensics concluded that it wasn't something easily obtainable, and that someone with either chemical knowledge or special access must have acquired it. This led Jane to search George's storage facility, where she found traces of the same poison. The vials containing the substance had been hidden, though not carefully enough to completely cover it up. However, there wasn't yet enough concrete evidence to charge George immediately, and Jane needed more time to piece the entire case together. As the clues began to emerge, tensions among the characters escalated. Anna started to panic as she realized all the evidence was gradually stacking up against her. She tried to explain that giving Michael the sleeping pills was just to help him relax, and she never intended to harm him. But with the discovery of the poison in Michael's system, Anna's explanation became increasingly weak. Jane noticed the psychological turmoil within Anna, as she constantly changed her story and showed clear fear of being implicated. George, on the other hand, grew more and more uneasy as Jane probed deeper. Initially, he presented himself confidently, but the relentless questions about his access to the poison, his relationship with Anna, and his possible motive for killing Michael slowly eroded that confidence. "I only wanted to help Anna. We never intended to harm Michael," George said. But his eyes no longer held the composure they once did. The inconsistencies in George's words made Jane increasingly suspicious that he was the mastermind behind the entire plan, but she still lacked the definitive evidence to accuse. As Jane continued to unravel the affair between Anna and George, she couldn't ignore other emerging leads. Testimonies from neighbors around Michael's house and footage from security cameras began to reveal more about the secret meetings between the two. A video from a security camera in the area showed Anna returning home around the time of the crime, contradicting her initial statement that she wasn't home. Jane decided to confront Anna again. And the truth became clearer. Anna had lied about not being at the scene when Michael died. Jane knew she was getting closer to the heart of the matter, but many questions remained unanswered. Was Anna merely a pawn in Georgia's plan, or had she actively participated in the murder? George clearly had a strong motive, especially with the increasing business disputes between him and Michael. But was that motive enough for him to truly carry out the crime? Step by step, Jane gathered clues and pieced together the story. Tension continued to rise between Anna and George as they began to turn on each other in their confrontation with the truth. Anna's panic and George's growing unease made Jane feel that they were hiding something much bigger, and she knew she had to act quickly before everything spiraled out of control. Jane Harper's investigation reached a critical point when the entire affair between Anna and George was exposed. It was undeniable. Romantic messages, photos, and even evidence from security cameras revealed the full truth. Under pressure from Jane, Anna finally admitted that she and George had been having an affair for months. George had sweet-talked her, convincing her that they could have a happy future together if Michael were no longer in the picture. He promised that once Michael was gone, they would live a completely new life, free from all burdens. What Anna didn't realize was that George never actually intended to live with her. In his mind, Anna was merely a pawn in his plan to get revenge on Michael for their past financial disputes. George wasn't the lover she thought he was. Everything had been meticulously calculated, from exploiting Anna's emotions to manipulating her into becoming part of the plot to kill her husband. Brainwashed and blinded by promises, Anna had fully trusted George, never realizing that she was merely a tool for him to achieve his goal. The complexity of the case became even more apparent when a vial of poison was found in Anna's car. This vial contained the same poison that had killed Michael, but what was strange was how it had been placed in her car in such an unusual way, as if someone had deliberately left it there. Jane immediately suspected that this could be planted evidence. She not only examined Anna's behavior, but also analyzed every possible motive George might have had. Finally, the truth began to surface. George had intentionally framed Anna. Everything from start to finish had been his scheme to pin the blame on her, while he escaped as the innocent bystander in Michael's death. Upon discovering this harsh truth, Anna spiraled into panic. The realization that she had been nothing more than a puppet in George's hands made her painfully aware of her terrible mistake. She had allowed herself to be used, led by the nose through each step of the plan, from giving Michael the sleeping pills to standing idly by as her husband died without realizing what was happening. Anna began to feel as if everything was collapsing around her. She tried to deny her involvement in Michael's death, but Jane knew there was no turning back for her. Under pressure, Anna shifted from panic to defense. "I loved George, but I didn't kill Michael," she insisted, her eyes wide with desperation. She repeatedly claimed that George had driven everything, that she only wanted to save her happiness and her children. But no matter how hard she tried to deny it, Anna couldn't escape the fact that she had been a part of the plot from the beginning. Jane could see that Anna was trying to wriggle free from the trap she had set for herself, but it was already too late. As George faced increasingly clear accusations from Anna and the mounting evidence, his anxiety became more evident. When Jane interrogated him once more, his initial confidence vanished, replaced by the demeanor of a cornered liar. "I only wanted to protect Anna. I never intended to kill Michael," George stammered, attempting to salvage his image as a good friend. But his words no longer convinced anyone, especially as the forensic evidence and security footage began to link him directly to the crime scene. Forensic analysis had proven that the poison used to kill Michael came from a source to which only George had access. From that evidence, Jane had enough to charge George, but he hadn't been arrested just yet. George tried to escape, but his increasingly erratic behavior and psychological signs betrayed him. He no longer had the rational arguments to defend himself, and even though he attempted to remain calm under Jane's questioning, the truth was clear. George was the mastermind behind Michael's death. The confrontation between Anna and George grew increasingly intense. While Anna desperately tried to pin all the blame on George, he, in turn, attempted to argue that it was all Anna's doing. Both were caught in a vortex of lies, betrayal, and dark truths. Jane, watching the collapse of both, realized that this case wasn't just a simple crime but a tragedy of relationships twisted by greed and selfishness. Tension continued to mount. As the evidence against George became undeniable, he gradually found himself isolated, with no way out but to face the consequences of his actions. But Jane knew that even though George would be arrested, this case would leave lasting scars on Anna's soul, having been swept into a nightmare with no escape. The battle between truth and deceit, between lovers and betrayers, had reached its peak. Jane was closer than ever to solving the case, but she also knew that the damage left behind by this case would haunt everyone involved long after it was over. The final showdown between Jane Harper and George took place in the interrogation room, where every secret and dark plot slowly unraveled. With sharp psychological insight, Jane was ready to corner George. The evidence of the rare poison, the romantic messages between him and Anna, along with the security camera footage, had woven a web from which he could not escape. George sat before Jane, his hands trembling slightly, though his eyes tried to remain calm, masking the tension inside. "We have everything, George," Jane began, her voice cold. "We know about the poison in Michael's body. That poison can only be found in one place and you have access to it." Jane didn't stop watching him, not a single reaction escaping her keen eye. George remained silent, his eyes flicking across the documents on the table, as if searching for an escape route. He knew he was cornered, but wasn't ready to admit it. "And what about those secret meetings with Anna? The whole town knows she was Michael's wife. But what about you, George? What did you do to make her believe you two could live happily together if Michael disappeared?" Jane fired question after question, pushing George into a tight spot. George exhaled deeply, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. I didn't kill Michael. It was all just a coincidence," he replied, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Jane smirked. "A coincidence? You think something this meticulously planned is a coincidence? You know full well Anna couldn't have done this alone. You're the one who planned it all, manipulating her into carrying out your scheme." Jane leaned forward, her voice sharper. "You never loved her, George. That was just an excuse for you to get rid of Michael, because of your personal grudge." Under pressure, George shot up from his seat, trying to escape the truth. But Jane had anticipated this. "Don't do something stupid, George. This is your last chance to confess." Just then, George pushed the chair back and bolted for the door. Jane immediately called for backup, but George had already made it out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing urgently on the tiled floor. The chase was filled with tension. George sprinted down the stairs, through the building's hallways, trying to find a way out. But the police had been prepared. As soon as George reached the exit, 2 officers were already there, blocking his path. They quickly subdued him. George struggled, but he knew it was time to face the consequences. After being arrested, George had nowhere left to run. In the interrogation room this time, he hid nothing. The immense pressure had finally broken him. "Yes, I've been planning this for a long time," George sighed, his eyes weary. "I was sick of Michael, tired of living in his shadow. He always thought he was the smartest, always thought he could control everything. But he was wrong." Jane listened attentively, maintaining her professional demeanor, even though she knew the case was coming to a close. "And you used Anna to carry out that plan," she continued, her eyes never leaving him. George nodded, the last of his arrogance fading away. "Anna? She was weak, easily manipulated. I promised her we'd live together, but in reality, she was just a tool to get rid of Michael." George showed no remorse, his voice still cold. "I never intended to stay with her. Once everything was done, I was going to leave her." The forensic team later confirmed that the poison found in Michael's body was a rare compound, accessible only from a warehouse where George had exclusive access. This was the final piece of evidence that sealed his fate. George had long planned to kill Michael, using Anna to cover his tracks. But his perfect plan had been undone by the evidence, and Jane Harper's relentless persistence. The case closed with an inevitable conclusion. George was convicted of murder and faced a heavy sentence. But for Jane, this wasn't just about solving a case. It was a story of deceit, greed, and the destruction caused by selfishness. Anna, although not the one who physically killed her husband, had to face the psychological and legal consequences of her own weakness and blindness. As the case concluded, Detective Jane Harper stood outside the courthouse, looking out over the quiet town where the tragedy had unfolded. She reflected on what had transpired, realizing that greed, betrayal, and selfish calculations in personal relationships were the root causes of the Lavelle family's downfall. It all started with small cracks in the marriage. But when trust was broken and secrets began to surface, tragedy became inevitable. Anna, though she hadn't directly killed Michael, could not escape the consequences of her actions. Her life had been ruined by the affair with George, a man she trusted, but who had in reality only used her for his cruel scheme. Anna would not only have to face regret, but also the pain and loss she had brought upon herself. This case served as a lesson about the importance of honesty and trust within a family. Secrets, no matter how small, can fester into fatal wounds if left unresolved. The Lavelle family, once a symbol of success and happiness, now stood as a heartbreaking example of how love and trust, when betrayed, can lead to devastating consequences. The story didn't end simply. Although George had been convicted, and the truth had been revealed, the emotional scars it left behind would last long after the case was closed. It concluded with an open ending, leaving the reader to ponder deeply about the value of truth and the far-reaching consequences of betrayal in relationships.